And here is another episode of All Things Conflict with me, your host, Maria Arper. And today I got a really special guest. His name is Andrew Pritchard, and he has led the most extraordinary life, from, the highs and criminal gangs to his downfall in prison, but not just stopping there. It's about how he turned that around, how he learned and understood the prison system and then worked out what we can do to help the prison crisis. I think you're going to find this absolutely riveting, as I have. I met Andrew a short while ago and every conversation leaves me enriched. So let's jump in. Andrew, how amazing to have you on the podcast. Now,
yeah, thank you for having me on, Marie.
Yeah, we only met a few months ago at one of those dinner things, and I was immediately riveted by, you're a big man and you've got a big story, but I was riveted by the changes and the things that you've done in life. And, you've got a book coming out, which you very kindly sent me an early copy of. And I just want to read one part from the beginning and then have you pick it up. Would that be okay?
Of course it would, yeah.
Yeah. Thanks, Andrew. So the book's called Empire of Dirt. Andrew wasn't just a player. He was an architect. From street corners to Caribbean supply lines, from acid house dance floors to courtroom battles, he built empires. And when it all collapsed spectacularly, he found himself locked behind the gates of Britain's toughest prisons. That should have been the end of the story, but it wasn't. And so what I'm really wanting to do is, the book is riveting and your life is spectacular. And actually, as I read the book, what I started to think was, wow, if you'd had like the privilege of a middle class education, you probably would have been Prime Minister. That you probably would have put your efforts into a different space. And so if people want to read, your life story and the things that you did, buy the book. I think, when does it come out? 5th of March?
Yeah. So the 5th of March, the ebook was released, a hardback and paperback edition. And on 2nd of June, a premium gold copy edition will be released, with gold leaf with full colour images in there. And that basically comes out. Also, the audio book will be released at the same time. And that's more or less to, collaborate with the Chinese New Year, obviously, which comes into play in February, not too far from now. But I'm on Firehorse, which is the year of the Firehorse this year, which is, that was once said, every 66 years. My mother was also a golden horse, so I thought it was apt to do something special and make an addition to the book that obviously would be a collector, more for collectors.
Yeah, and that would be, I would say, very typical of the way your mind works, is to think about the detail and the depth and the connections of things. So, so there is this life and there was prison, and then you rethink. And I'd love for you to pick it up from there, because what you're doing is equally spectacular. Maybe not as glamorous in the way that we like entertaining ourselves, but certainly spectacular.
Well, thank you, Marie. And you're right. Yeah, obviously, I've lived a very full life, to say the least. But people call me various things. One of them is Andy Nine Lives, because I seem to have lived 9 lives and, still going. Some of the things I've done. But, let's put those to the side. As you said, people can go out and get the book and read all about those things. But let's pick up from where my life took a different turn, which is probably the most significant one there is, where it is today. And where that sort of journey started was early into my sentence. I'd been sentenced to 15 years in prison for drug trafficking and perverting the course of justice. And I found myself as a high security category prisoner, and I was at HMP Belmarsh. during my time at Belmarsh, for the first time, I can honestly say I actually felt remorse for what I'd done. And most people say that word and they reflect upon themselves. And it's like, oh, I feel sorry for myself because I'm serving a big sentence. And they're not truly rehabilitated or want to accept rehabilitation because they haven't actually thought of the impact of what they were doing and done on other people. And it's easy to think of the inner circle, which will affect obviously, your loved ones. But if you think about the victims, because there's no such thing as victimless crime, as much as we try to tell ourselves as criminals, it doesn't affect this person or that person, and there's nothing really wrong with it because so and so does it or takes it. But it's very destructive in any way you do. I was a drug trafficker. I imported prolific amounts of drugs into this country over a long, sustained period of years. And I remember the prosecutor, when he was making his going into the judge with the sentencing speech, he put forward that, this man's destroyed thousands of lives and responsible for probably hundreds of murders, for bringing drugs in, and, this fuels gangland wars. And, he was saying all this stuff, but when it was coming one day, coming out the other, I thought he was just making this big, charade up to push my sentence up. But it didn't really reflect on me until one afternoon walking the prison yard, and I come across a guy that I knew. I knew his parents, and he was walking. He was talking to me. There's a term in German they call you uncle because you're a bit older than everyone in there. He was serving a life sentence, and another kid I knew was across, the yard, and these two kids were like, enemies. And I was like, hold on, you can't be enemies because I know. Your parents, I know his uncles really well, and your family's really close, almost like cousins. And he was like, yeah, but you don't get it. It's all a postcode thing. And, we can't take tea because of this, because of the other. I'm like, well, tell me what you're talking about. Postcode, what is the depth of it? He's like, uncle, you got to understand. He said, how I feel about my postcode is on my estate. I love every single brick, of the thing, we love it. And, we'd die for it. And I was like, wow. You're living in an area now which is basically, being an inflow of people who have got money, who are buying all the houses, and all these areas like Ladbroke Grove, Hackney, wherever you can think, it's desired real estate. And these kids who are killing each other, will never have opportunity of buying a house or a property on that estate. So they're killing each other effectively for nothing. And I reflected back at my life growing up, as a kid, and I thought to myself, being my mother was Jamaican, my father was English, the West Indian community particularly, we never believed in babysitters, we couldn't afford them. So what you'd do is you'd get dropped off at auntie and uncle's house, and all the other kids would be dropped off there, So you'd have cousins that weren't even your cousins, but you got to know a lot of, people, especially of colour, and you looked out for each other in a schooling environment. If someone's picking on someone, so even though it's my cousin, and it was easily said, but it did unify a community of young people. And I thought to myself, look how it's changed, because kids don't even communicate anymore. They're on mobile phones all day. They don't have conversations. And I thought that's probably why conflicts start, because they don't know how to communicate. And they won't just have a punch up in a playground that it's done. They'll sit there, they'll fester, it'll escalate, and then one gets a knife and stabs the other one. And it seemed to me this is a problem, but more to the point of the problem, I thought all these kids coming into the system, doing 30, 40-year recs, which is before they even have a chance of parole. And did you really want to kill someone? I asked myself that question. And I don't think you really want to kill someone. I think you've done it because you thought you had to do it. The bravado of being part of that, full sense of security, being part of a gang and having to do it. And, do you want to serve a life sentence? And the question is definitely not. Because that life sentence, when you land in prison, it all changes, because suddenly from what you think you had is all gone. And then when it all goes, you're a burden on everyone, because they've got to come and visit you for the next 20 or 30 years. They've got to be sending you up money. You're back to the stage of a child almost, from being a big man on the street. And then I thought, you don't want to get killed either. The last thing you want to do is end up getting killed. So I thought, this is a big problem. How can I do something to change it? The biggest issue that really existed was conflict within the prison system, because particularly Belmarsh was a case of catchment for the Old Bailey. And naturally, with the Old Bailey, you've got, murder trials going on every single day. And dominantly, they're going to be a lot of them postcode gangs. And the whole introduction of joint enterprise played a big part of that, because whereas it was easy conviction, it was hard for the police to make a conviction of more than one person, particularly on murder, unless it was a conspiracy. You have to have all kinds of other records to trace it. Joint enterprise was real simple because it just meant, all you had to be was, associated with somebody. And if you were even there or near the crime, you could be part of it. And a jury was set out to deliberate, saying, did they have a foresight to know he was going to commit an act that could have led to someone's death? And how do you tell a juror? It's effectively saying, "Oh, you're a mind reader." That's what it's saying to him. It's saying, did he, could he imagine that could have happened? How can you imagine? If you and me and you were to walk into a space now, and there are examples of this actually, but not you, Maria, saying you do that. But if you had a knife on you and you saw something like you stabbed them, and I was with you, under law of joint enterprise, because I've walked in there with you, it could be said that I'm an accomplice and I'll be charged with murder. And the criminal justice system, I'm familiar with it. I know how it works. And I know how there are people in there, unscrupulous lawyers and law firms who are looking to make as much money as they can. And a lot of the, law firms do actually take their clients down a wild goose chase because murder is a big ticket, thing. And they know full well that it's going to be a long trial. It's going to be a lot of papers to be read. You're going to QCs have to be engaged with it. So they'll carry someone through. They don't got hoping of actually, getting away with it or, being found not guilty in order to drain every penny out of it. But then when they go and they get found guilty by the jury and they're given a huge sentence, it's them that's going to do the life sentence. And the false belief young people get is, oh, I didn't do it. And, I can't be found guilty because I didn't do. And that's put into their heads, but they don't realise that what the jury says and how they make up their mind is completely out of your control. And I looked at those aspects and thought, wow, there's a lot of people here, basically kids that didn't understand the system, and because they're not criminals. You know what I mean? They got involved in gangs, but you couldn't call them criminals. They're babies. And on the other side of the coin, I thought to myself, as soon as they come into prison, because of the conflicts, there's immediate disruption. And it was a bit selfish of me because myself and another category prisoner, a friend of mine, a guy called Clifford Hobbs, who was, double Cat A, he'd have 13 years and security units, he was an armed robber and he had escaped from prison as well, from broke loose from a security van, taken into prison. So, he was a very high risk, but he was the same age as me, a little bit older, of the same opinion as me, that, we can't be getting locked up every 30 seconds because the bell constantly goes off. Every time one kid comes into the prison, he attacks another kid who's the opposite number of the gang, his ops. So after it was continuous and, lasting on his constantly getting locked down, I was a listener. So listeners, as you probably know, the system in prison is, we work under Samaritans and you kind of get to have safer custody meetings where you sit in on. And I sat in every month they used to take place, and I'd spoken to the safer custody governor, a lovely lady called Beverly Clark, who used to be a prison officer, worked her way up. And I said to her, look, I really think we could actually do something to actually bring down some of the issues that happen in prison today. And she was like, what do you think? Because we're tired of it. I said, well, this is dangerous because there are kids getting randomly attacked, tuna tin lids, and officers are trying to break up. They're getting slashed or cut or battered. The place is getting closed down constantly. It's a horrible environment for prisoners. It's unsafe for visitors or people who've been visiting the prison. They could get caught up in this. I said, I think I've got a suggestion. We give us some room to try it. So she said, what is it? I said, I think a lot of guys coming through the prison system on accumulated visits. They come down from dispersed. We're big names in the system. A lot of those are gang members. They probably like to stay here a little bit longer before getting shipped back up to dispersal. I think they could mediate a lot of these problems that happen, And she initially thought the idea, he sort of, over a few months, was coaxing her towards it, and then said, previously, just before my arrest, I'd opened a film studio, and part of that, the building I owned, a part of it was being used for actually a community interest company, which worked, with development of mentoring. Not that it helped me, obviously, but one of the guys I'd known, David Frederick, I'd known Dead Freddy from a previous sentence where I was on remand for a very big case, which was 500 tons of cocaine at the time. which, you know, 7's got acquitted on. But David, he wasn't on that charge. He was on a different charge. He'd done his time, but he actually took about going to, you know, become a mentor. And he's got his petals, and he's, you know, actually was trying to break through. I said to him, look, I said, why don't you know, come and let's do something. Can we start to fund this, you know, put this thing forward while I teach him media and film and things like this. So David was sort of floating in the background. And when it came to it, I said, look, I said, I'm the perfect person who can come in, because I don't expect you as prisoners to be able to completely deliver this. Let me get prisoners who can support this, and let me get, you know, David to come in with the Reformed Foundation, which is a company I set up as Reformed Productions, and try to put together a lesson plan that can work and can be taught the mentors, because the guys who we're going to bring in, they themselves need to be cured, you know, because they've got their issues. Let's deal with that situation. Let's teach them how to then work with others. So it was a real simple idea, very straightforward. It was, when kids come straight in, the first place you're going to get them is going to be the first night centre, where they arrive at reception. And the simple question is, they're asked by the prison officer, are you part of a gang? Well, why would you ask them that for? Because, of course, they're not stupid. They know if they say, yes, they are part of a gang, that becomes an aggregating factor in sentencing. That's going to get you these 3 or 4 more years on top of whatever sentence you're only going to get. And it could prejudice the trial as well considerably if the information's given to the police. So they say no, automatically they're put onto a wing and they're surrounded by their enemies, because that is the nature of postcode gangs. You have an enemy on every corner. But in prison, you can't get away from that, you know? So they land, as soon as they arrive, more often than not, they make the first move to attack someone, because they know that they're walking into the lion's den. So if they attack someone, then they're exited to the block where they feel they're relatively safe until they get to the next destination. So we were like, first thing we've got to do is we have to be able to get access to the first night centre, where we can put someone effectively as a spotter. And when the, you know, person comes in, you say to them, look, we know you are part of a gang. All I want to know is what gang you're part of, because we're going to try to separate you on a different wing until we can mitigate the problem. And of course, people did free up, particularly when it's someone coming who's at the first night centre who was a former gang member of some kind. They recognise or they know, especially if they're more senior or been more senior in that role. And that was the first, you know, point of contact made. Second point of contact was to get, we had 8 mentors who were all affiliated to gangs. And these guys were going to, from all over various places, they would mediate the problem. So if 2 guys, one's, let's say, from Tottenham and the other one was, let's say, from Brixton or from Peckham or wherever there might have been a dispute, we'd then get 2, you know, senior role members from each area who had previously been parts of gangs, and they would sit down and they would say, you know, basically, if you put this conflict, you know, on hold, because, you know, you're 30, 40 year sentence. When you say put it on hold while it's in there, it's forever, isn't it? Right? But they don't want to know that you're just dropping it, because naturally, you know, you killed someone's relative or their best friend. You don't want it to be, you know, lose face, so to speak. So you give them that option to not lose face completely, but then give them the benefit to say, look, you know, if you do get sentenced, if you be part of this gang and you sign this compact, the benefits you're going to have is you'll get an extra gym session, because, you know, we're going to offer you that to get out of the cell. You're also going to be privileged to certain talks and things. We're going to bring people in, and they're going to help assist us in what we do. And we had Peacock's Gym, the 2 brothers that run Peacock's Gym, Martin and Tony, very successful gym in Canning Town. Does a lot of stuff for the local community. They themselves obviously have got a little history. Tony's children came in and worked with us, you know, and they brought people in who've done talks. And also it was very constructive, and prisoners like to engage in that. Felt special. But not only did it dramatically reduce all the conflicts once it got going, I think 97% of all conflicts were resolved, you know, which is massive. Anyone who interacted with it, the program. It also meant that people wanted to become the next set of mentors, which created a feel-good factor throughout the prison, because what you had was people opposed to wanting to be, you know, putting up the gang bravado, realised there was a certain comfort you had in being able to, you know, be responsible and give advice. And if you look at the basic, you know, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that sits right there at the very top, where you want to be able to give advice to people. And the only thing these kids probably give advice on or knew anything about was gang lifestyle. and they were experts at it because this is what they and ran, and it was successful, and it worked really, really well. I, however, have got quite a reputation, let's just say, in the criminal justice system. I'd been an organised criminal for the best part, at least of 35 years, at a very high level. So I was really known to the police, all the authorities, and I wasn't particularly liked in terms of the establishment. You must understand it, because, why would they want to be, a cheerleader in my sort of band? It's not going to happen. So I was myself moved to HMP Whitemoor, high security prison. But rather than, losing, hope, or, turning my back and saying, right, that's it, I'm tired of this. And I was exited from there as well in such a way it would be enough for you to be very bitter. I remember I had something had happened. You read about it in the book, and long story short, there was a document, a piece of paper that had appeared, and what happened was I got access to it, and I asked one of the officers to put it into the safe at Belmarsh, and he actually done it. A very diligent officer. He actually put it in there, put it into the safe, and then when I was calling upon it, to get it retrieved in order to go into trial, because I was on remand at that time, they couldn't find it, and he went missing from Belmarsh safe. Don't know how it happened, but the man was very diligent. He put it in there, but somehow it's gone missing, and they had to have a full, review into it. And I went to the ombudsman, and the ombudsman found in my favour. It became a real problem. Security governor effectively was affected by that, because how could something go missing out of safe in Belmarsh? It's like unheard of. It was really bad, because I had a history of police corruption as well. So it was ringing alarm bells and looking incredibly intense. And long story short, he got the hump because they moved him from security to another department. And it was Listeners' Day visit where my fiance was coming in with my son. I was in the waiting room, and then all of a sudden two officers walked in and said, you're on a bus to Whitemoor, and pulled me before I had the visit, after they were waiting for an hour, to come and see me. So I was very bitter, that treatment after doing something which was good in the system, but I didn't get disheartened by it, because I knew that was going to be the game that I'd be going through. And I'm a big boy, do you know what I mean? I played the game and I knew what it was like, and I believe that at the end of the day, don't do something if you can't deal with the consequences of it. Mm-hmm. That's anything, and I lived by that rule. And so I went to Whitemoor, and I found myself in the same situation, but it was different because it was a different environment, because the high securities identified that young people were now going into the system, and what they wanted to do, they didn't want the conflicts with the gangs. So, not saying all of them, but a high number were converting to Islam, because it was it was relatively safe, the conversion, because if you become a brother, you would generally be sort of overseeing. The conflict couldn't just happen as simple as that. Now, if people find faith naturally, I think it's a very good thing in prison, regardless of the faith, because it can be a very, sturdy tool for you to get through your sentence with. But if people sometimes just join, it's like joining up another gang. Do you know what I mean? And I didn't really think that was a good mechanism. So I thought, we need to think of something that could give people an option, And we, it was like, okay, so I started to look at how I could write courses and develop them. And I started to work on some, but Whitemoor was a little bit more complex, because the hierarchy that sits in there is deeply rooted in dispersal prisons over a number of years, I'd say, since the Good Friday Agreement. And, the Irish community moved out of the system. And obviously there was a lot of attacks on mainland Britain. You had a very high Islamic, presence coming into prison. So it wasn't something that seemed, you'd want to interfere with too much, because it was, it was very, very deeply rooted. And, eventually there'll be a system or a mechanism that will help, develop that, people feel independently to what they've got to do. But I concentrated more on things that I knew I could now move on and do. And one of them was, I spoke to my offender manager, and I said, look, I want to come off the category A's. So, what courses can I do? Because I'm in here for drug trafficking. And she was like, can you do money management? I said, well, great respect, I was a drug smuggler. I'm pretty good at managing money. Do you know what I mean? I was bloody well, I had it all over the world. And so I don't think I really need that, And she was like, well, there's no courses. I said, hold on. I said, look, I don't want to be obvious here, but if you go into any local, certainly prison, and the queue for meds is longer than the dinner queue, right? So there's a clear problem with people who take drugs in prisons or getting involved in drugs in prisons. Prisons full of drug dealers, you've got no courses to change their behaviour. Prisons just going to become an opportunity to sell more drugs to junkies because you've got it's like you're walking into a shop full of customers, isn't, it's like, so there's your problem.
Totally.
We need a course, and what does that course look like? And I thought to myself, that course looks like, what would I have done differently? And I've had loads and loads of businesses. And you talk to most young people, you're an entrepreneur, you want to be an entrepreneur. I was spirited from my parents because my mum was a real hustler, entrepreneur in every sense of the word, from selling, dresses to, sort of done, we kind of grafted. And it was like, wouldn't it be nice to actually pass across some entrepreneurial skills to these kids? So understanding the basic product you're selling, you sell it, you do really incredible, about restocking, about marketing, a product you can't market as effectively, but they still were able to market it. And, you could do all these wonderful things, you've got great attributions, but then you're going to get locked up because of what you're selling. If you can get a product or set up a business that you actually aren't going to go through that potential minefield of all this stuff, you're not going to walk at your house and get killed potentially unless you're really unlucky, you're not going to have all these other things. Why don't you look at it and try to develop those businesses? So I thought, I'm going to build a course, and I wrote something called Hindsight, because hindsight is reflections to me that we look back at. And, I talk a lot of people to different people about this, and I say, if you were to take the option is this: if I gave you a kilo of cocaine, hypothetically speaking, and that kilo of cocaine, I don't know, you're into me for £20,000, 30,000, right? And then you're going to go and sell that kilo of cocaine, maybe make £500 and £1,000 on it, right? You'll then have the risk of, if you were to lose it, okay, it could be robbed and stolen from you. So what are the consequences of that happening? The consequences of that, so you might put yourself in danger having it anyway, right? Away from the police coming and locking you up for it and giving you a certain amount of time in prison. You then owe the person for it, and, it could be quite a ruthless business. You can get yourself shot, beaten up with hammers. You can have your family put at risk. You've got all these different things that could go wrong taking that kilo of cocaine to make £1,000. Now, if you were to walk into an office, let's say, or to a job, the worst thing that could possibly go wrong is you lose your job, and you get fired, and you find another job. So if you put it in the same frame of mind, who in their right mind would want to enter into an occupation like that? You just wouldn't. So there's something fundamentally wrong in the first place in the way you think. And thinking and decision making is a really important part of the process. And some people just naturally get it and understand it when they get older, because we do sometimes rehabilitate with age. Some don't, though. You take less risk usually. Now, I was of the mindset, and I thought to myself, wow, so what can you do? But more importantly, what can I do? And I thought, let's look at it. So, Gladstone's theory of 10,000 learning hours makes you an expert authority on a subject. Yeah. And I thought, they open that door at 7 o'clock in the morning, they close it again at, 4. And that's you every single day for the next God knows how many years. If you just take those hours, okay, and you apply them over 3 years or 4 years, you're an expert authority. So all you've got to do is, rather than, running around like an idiot up and down the wings and doing some nonsense in the, temporary workshops, why not go and work in the different departments, which actually I'll learn something about the prison system, how it works. So I worked my way from prospect to resettlement. I worked into, the activities hubs. I maintained working as a listener. I worked in healthcare department, and I moved myself from category A prison to category B prison, to category C prison, to category D prison eventually. So I went through all the categories. So I'd experienced what every single, level of security was in different prisons up and down the country, and worked in different departments as I went through it. And I told myself and educated myself that the day I walk out of this prison, I'm an expert authority with lived experience. And that's the greatest thing, because people, academics who go to university, college to study, criminology and take up various posts and jobs in government or in the system have never been to prison. That's obviously part of the remit. I've been to prison and I know the inside, how it works, and I know it backwards. So that's a business for me straight away. And I thought, wow, how many opportunities would there be for inmates who are in prison now if they thought like that? Turn your life around, taking that basic understanding. And as you grow in years again, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we go back to that, where you find yourself in a different ladder, you move your relationships from, the basic stuff, which is here, sex, kind of roof over your head. Then you kind of step up relationships, mean more sentimental, then family, homes. And then you go up. And this should happen with age. And you find yourself, and recognition was the point I was at. So it was important for me to create something, to come out of prison and rectify some of the things the bad stuff I'd done, make good of that, fix it back properly, but leave a legacy behind me in doing so by taking the experiences and the things that I'd done, not to brag or use as a vanity project, which I've done in the past and lived on my own bravado and people, being my greatest supporters because they're making money from you, but actually say, no, I've got to tell the truth here. I've got to say this life is a complete waste of time and it will end up only one way. And, talk about the bad stuff, not the necessarily good stuff. And it's very rare that criminals into other criminals because usually, I hate to say it, most of the people that do it are unsuccessful criminals. They perhaps burglar, they get a little sentence, they're in and out of prison, they've got on to become a mentor now. But there are very few that have really played at the highest level and kind of exited at a high level of success. And I thought, I have credibility. I need to do this because I think my voice can be heard. And I've done it, Marie. I walked out of prison in mid-February 2019. And I think a week later, I started to create the AP Foundation as a CIC. I think 2 months later, it was incorporated. And less than 11 months from there, I got charity status and moved it into a registered charity. And I took all the attributes. I had people who were very key to this sector, who people I knew from other legitimate businesses in some cases that I owned because I had a good portfolio of legitimate businesses running alongside my drug smuggling activity. And people actually, especially in the music industry and film industry, came to me and said, we're happy to get involved in what you're doing. In fact, one of my first trustees was Donald McIntyre, the journalist, who actually made a documentary about me, 10 years before. He came on board and put himself as a trustee. So gave you an idea of the impact, that it was starting to make and where it was going. And that was the beginning of the AP Foundation.
Amazing. Yes. Well, I mean, it doesn't happen overnight, does it? I mean, there's all the learning and, as you said, the 10,000 hours. And there were so many things that, as you were talking, that really popped up for me. And I thought, oh my God, we think in a similar way. The first one was about the postcode conflicts, because at one point I was chair of a Key Stage 4 pupil referral unit. And we had kids that would, be suspended. And then they'd have to have a sort of coming back into school interview. And I said, we have to bring the parents. No, we can't just sit with a 14-year-old who doesn't want to be in the room. So I started to bring the parents in who were from different postcodes, and the kids' eyes would be out on stalks as the parents were shaking hands with each other and saying what a nonsense it all was. And that had such a great effect. And then all the things you talked about, watching what was happening in prison. And, as you know, I've had a prison project since 2009, and it's morphed and it's evolved as we do more and more things. And, mediating disputes is really, really important. And that can only be done by people with lived experience. So we do the same thing. We train people. But then what we did was we said, actually, the problem with mediation is that it waits for something to happen, or it anticipates something happening. So we actually do a lot of work one-to-one with the people who are struggling, because anyone who's struggling for whatever reason, whether that's with bravado or, despair, they're not going to be able to sit on that frustration for very long before they act it out in some way. So there was a lot in what you shared that was all about how do you look at something what I had was this idea of you seeing an exploded diagram, you know, the sort of blueprint, and then going, well, when you look at it as a whole blueprint, there are many pieces that could be moved around, and it doesn't involve, you know, knocking the whole thing down and starting again. They're simple adjustments, aren't they, that can just make a huge amount of difference.
Well, you know, I'm again, you know, classic Simpson ADHD, and I put things together on bits of paper and in my mind. I don't write these great diagrams and, you know, document things, but things are very clear to me. Straight away, I can look at the situation. It all makes sense how you can fix it, you know. And I think that's been the smuggler for many years. You didn't look for, you know, problems, you look for solutions, you know, how you can get around things and fix things. And, you know, I see things very clearly. And I remember one of the biggest things was I had this conflict situation in a very dire way. As a concert promoter, I was bringing Reggae Sunsplash back to the United Kingdom, and we were putting on an event at Victoria Park for 50,000 people. Now, this was in 1999, and I don't know if you're familiar with 1999. It was literally, there were terrible outbreaks of, you know, gang shootings, was coming to play. A lot of it was, you know, Afro-Caribbean based, as yardies. And this was just pre-postcode gangs really arriving on the scene. But there was a lot of bloodshed happening, and there was 13 shootings just over one period of that particular, you know, that fall. And it was a completely huge licensed event, you can imagine. And we were interacting, obviously, with the, you know, the blue services, the police, and the, you know, health and safety, and, you know, evidence brigade, everyone possible you needed to put an infrastructure of production that size in place. And the police were like, you know, you may have to call this off because, you know, there's a black outbreak of shootings and murders, and Reggae Sunsplash is going to be, you know, the off jump off that ladder point, and there's no way on earth you're going to get away with 50,000 people without someone getting killed. It's, you know, and they were threatening to pull the license, you know, after we'd spent best part of close to £1 billion preparing the artists, you know, and all the infrastructure that went into that event. And thought, there's no way we can lose this. And I spoke to someone, extended family really, you know, so I was an uncle who was deeply involved in it and had helped me get licensed to produce it because he promoted it previously. And he was like, you know, this is a generational event, Andrew. And I, what do you mean generation? He said, generation. He says, this isn't just an event where kids go to or young people. He said, this is a generation where their parents, but more importantly, their grandparents are going to come to. He said, no, you know, they may kick off in front of their parents here, but they're not kick off in front of their grandparents. Well, yes. It's different now, but then there was a certain flow, especially amongst the Afro-Caribbean community. And I was like, what can we do? My mum, she was obviously a staunch, you know, person within our community who had an off-licence in Hackney Wick, which every man used to sort of go to for advice. My mum got nicknamed by the gangsters as Mara Baker because she was just that person, you know, no messing about. And over a period, I think it was about 2 weeks, every evening, a different person was invited down there, you know, who was a senior person within those communities, from Holston to Brixton to Peckham to Tottenham. You know, it was everyone, people you didn't know existed, but they still had a very impact, you know, with their grandchildren or their children, you know. And it was one of those ones. And everyone kind of had this code of conduct that there would not be any trouble at Sunsplash, and there wasn't an incident. And that was amazing to have so many people in a time of such high conflict. And that's the thing about prisons. And I see now, you know, a lot of young people, particularly of colour, are, you know, flooding the system. And, you know, for numbers of reasons, postcode gang has been a big part of that. And actually, one of my proudest moments, strangely enough, was knowing it's a problem, especially with mixed race kids who suffer with identity problems. And an independent charity approached me a couple of years ago called Spark Inside. And they said they run a really successful course called The Hero's Journey. And they were looking to do something called the Black Hero's Journey, identifying black and mixed race, you know, young people in prison. And they were going to do the circle of change, which I'm very familiar with. And it's really bizarre because they actually created this course, which is now in, you've probably seen it, most prisons in England, and it's called the Black Hero's Journey. And they face a lot of my own life story. And I was invited by them for a training session they had in the Barbican. And one of their trainers was a group of people actually, you know, went through the course with us. And it was wonderful to see. And, you know, I take great pride in that, to think that maybe not just my own charity, but other charities actually using my story to inspire young people of colour, particularly, in changing their life, that change is possible, is a real feel of, again, it's great, it's on the pyramid, again, of, those Maslow's hierarchy. It's getting there, these are legacy things that make a huge difference. To talk to legacy to a young person is difficult. To talk to immediate self-gratification or, something you can get now is what they want to hear. But, that's what I try to do. And we're looking at reshaping the charity now. We're going through changes where I want to get back to what, I really started to do, get heavily involved in music and arts and business, and give young people that opportunity to set up their own business. But I think to myself as well, going through the DCATs, I saw so many people, who are white collar criminals, lawyers, accountants, business people, who got caught with their fingers in the till more often than not, but then they could never go back and work in financial services or work in the industries they're in before. And I thought, those people got such great experience. Wouldn't it be wonderful if the probation service thought, you know what, or even from DCAT prisons, where most of them are, if you had these young guys who do have these business ideas, these business plans, if you had a little think tank of maybe 4 of those guys, and they pulled that business plan apart for them, and they were able to, look at it and make it good, and actually work as their business mentors, all with lived experience, remember, the people who are mentoring you, the people who are actually there. And you could talk to a bank and say, listen, this is a brilliant idea. Why don't we just look at maybe, funding it, seed funding it, have a community bank, which my mum, she was famously done a community bank, which is called Pardis back in the day. West Indies couldn't buy houses, and banks weren't lending. But have a system in place that it gives opportunity for young people to set up their own business, who are either, on probation or coming out of the criminal justice system, or as intervention. They, haven't got there yet, but they're on the road to get into trouble. But you give it to them as a deterrent, but they generally engage in with it with a good chance of success, because if you get into a business you fail, it takes a little bit of your confidence away. But if you give them all the experience of people who are knowledgeable business people, and those assets you can draw from the criminal justice system, you can get them from, people who are returning residents after coming out of prison who can't work in those sectors anymore. You can utilise all these wonderful things rather than we think about construction, work on a builder's site, but no one wants to work on a builder's site. It's great if you get a job as, relatively well paid in the trades, which we've been encouraged and working towards, but there must be an alternative. And if you do alternative business and there are real success stories coming from those, I think then we turn a very important point in how we think about ex-offenders and how we think about, people's capabilities by giving them transferable skills. A lot of them they already have embedded into them, and they've grown and matured them over the years, but they've applied them to the wrong products and to the wrong devices. And they say organised criminals are either planning or working. And that's very, very true. And in prison, I was actually planning, but I wasn't planning the next crime.
Yes.
I was actually planning the next business.
So I'd love to share a really radical idea that my husband and I often talk about. And it'll never happen. But for me, this is, in your thinking, this is where I would go. Firstly, we have private prisons, but they're run by for-profit companies. So firstly, we need a private prison that is run by a not-for-profit. And the idea would be that, in any prison, and I've been in a few, you've got people like yourself who are entrepreneurial, creative. You've got people at every level, plus, just as a reflection of society, of people who are very unwell, probably shouldn't be in prison, but there's nowhere else to sort of put them. And the prison should actually balance itself out financially by the people running businesses that sell stuff that then brings in an income, so that actually it's zero profit and zero cost. And and then the people like you that are entrepreneurial and that can, make things happen would also have to think about, how are you going to look after, how much of the money's going to go to look after the people that are just never going to be able to do much, and how are you going to bring them up the ranks so they can make some kind of contribution and feel some sort of worth. What do you reckon on that as an idea?
It's an amazingly brilliant idea, and I think it's something that could be implemented, but you need a very strong team of people to put it into play. And whether the government would see fit of it will be a hard problem, because what you're right, there are 4 major companies that have private contracts for the prisons, and they are, and I'm not going to hit it because I had contracts with Serco and other big providers, but the reality is this: the prisons are in a terrible state. And you've got to understand this. I first entered the criminal justice system when I was a young man and went to what was YC, board school effectively. And I've seen how the prisons have changed and, where it's at. And, a lot of the prison officers, we used to have, don't talk to screws. And I laugh because it's like, I look at them as human beings now, and you didn't. As an inmate, you've got this whole thing in your head. And the older officers, people who actually took it as a career, it was hugely different because they were actually had a level of respect. They could be tough politically, but you got to understand a lot of them were ex-service military, and they looked at it. They would leave the army or the forces, and they were going to take on another a job that they felt they could, make a contribution towards. And they were strict. They were disciplined. They implemented that down on the people who were serving their sentences, but also you had a system whereas it was a career for them, and they were going to get good pay, good pension, and they would encourage their kids to do it. When, I hate to say it, Chris Grayling came in, he stripped all this stuff away and tried to get rid of them, which, it was a terrible thing because he pushed them out of their jobs, really, and made it unbearable. And the younger officers were coming in, very, very low wages, just subsidable, women officers, guys on the wing. They got a lot of time on their hands. So for them to be in a young woman's ear 24/7, giving her loads of attention, she's not going to get it outside. She gets it in prison. That makes her vulnerable straight away. You've got a link, a lapse of security right there. Then you've got young guys who are coming in and they're like, just literally out of school. And you've got guys who are in there, been training, or built like, monsters. And these young kids are frightened of them because they've got no experience of being in the military or being in this job. And it is literally like you walk around with your worst nightmare, you're bullied, school bully everywhere. There's one on, 50 on every landing. So you've got that situation where they feel vulnerable. So you've got no strength in terms of the authority. So you've lost all the authority in prisons, right? So first of all, you've got to fix that. And that's a huge job to fix because, the longer it's left, the worse it becomes. We know this. This is why there is so much corruption and drugs and such a terrible safe system. It's not safe in there. So what do we do? That's not going to be fixed overnight. The only way you can start to fix it is from using people within the system.
Exactly.
And my wide way of thinking is deeper than that. And I know this would be very controversial. I mentioned to several people, but my idea should be sentence reduction. Rather than constantly increasing sentences, you've got to understand that my theory of how this works. A guy gets a 30 or 40 year rec, he goes into prison as a young man. The first thing he does is he's got to survive for 30 years. He has to make a name for himself. So the minute he comes out of traps, he's fighting and he's being aggressive and he's being disruptive. And everyone coming in the system is seeing him that's the example they're going to set. Okay. If you said someone, especially gang guys, they're big names on the street, and from the day they walk in prison, if they know they can maybe get 5 years off of their sentence, if their behaviour is exceptional, but not only that, if they work to actually help mentors who are operating in those areas, being able to help guide them. And that way, what it does, it takes the bravado away, because when kids watch so-and-so go down for 2 murders and he's in prison, that's all you hear.
Well, that's what we call, in my world, we call it enlightened self-interest. So you help people to see a bigger picture, and the self-interest comes out of an enlightenment of a greater good.
And I think it's a good word for it, but I think where it has benefit is this. I get it. You don't want to reduce a sentence because you've got someone who's a victim, and you've got families who are upset by that, and the government want to be given out justifiably big sentences for that. But if you look at the taxpayer's point of view, they've got 5 less years to be paying, feeding, eating that person, right? The benefit that person can put into the system is going to be enormous, because what it means, it's a safer environment, and you're going to have a balance. Whereas inmates coming in are not going to be taking bad examples. They're going to be trying to set good examples for each other. And ultimately, the help it would give people on the outside, it would stop people going into prison. Because if you get the real story, not that there are no beefs in prison, because as soon as the gangs from different various postcodes up and down the country hit dispersal, takes you harder, they're all sitting eating together on the
I
table.
completely get it.
Kids
I
on the
mean, look,
street,
we could talk for hours, and we probably will. I mean, I think
yeah,
we have to
kids
meet
on the
up,
street
and I
killing each
think
other
there are.
still over those old beefs. It's just common sense thinking.
This is a really important and powerful conversation, and I wish we'd allowed more time for it. And I think that's
Yeah,
kind of my bad, but we will take this offline. And I think what we'll do is come back and look at, some of those ideas about how we can clear up the system, how we can improve it, and perhaps get to that non-profit prison that I
I would
was
love to. I think the
talking
idea is
about.
amazing, honestly amazing.
And
Okay,
and then also look at the restorative side of
yeah.
of justice, and I think I'd like to do some of that with you in person and some of it
Yeah,
back
most
online again.
definitely. And I love the idea what you're saying about a non-for-profit because, and people don't realise the workshops in prison, at Holden,
Yeah,
you were wrapping up headphones for Virgin Airlines. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
Richard Branson doesn't need cheap labour. You're
yeah,
doing making punnets for
yeah,
strawberries for Sainsbury's.
yeah,
Sainsbury's has got enough money. You're right. These jobs or work jobs should be created to make money for smaller organisations that can help
absolutely.
feed back into the safety of the prison and the rehabilitation.
So we've had an hour together, and it's been absolutely riveting. And as ever, I've only known you a short while, but every conversation with you always leaves me enriched.
Thank you. And
And
like,
and I just love, what's your sort of, if you had to encapsulate this conversation and what you really want people to take away from it in one sentence, what would that be?
hope. That's the
Hope.
one single word I will say, hope, because
Yeah,
in your deepest, darkest moments, and they say even basement's got a rock bottom, right? You can still, rise out of the situation and take any negative situation and turn it into a positive attribute. And I think that's the most important thing. I think anyone should take. You can take something which is a hopeless situation and create hope and actual, prosper from that idea. It's very possible.
fantastic. Absolutely. And I just want to say before we close, 5th of March, Empire of Dirt, your autobiography. I have had the privilege of reading it ahead of time. It is absolutely riveting. Thank you. Lots of
Pleasure.
love to you. Bye.
Always. Bye
Bye.
bye.